Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Kennedy. Welcome to History Nebraska's Brown Bag History Lecture Series, held monthly on the third Thursday in the Old Father Family Auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum. Learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not a member of History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Your support allows us to provide programs like the Brown Bag Lecture Series free for all Nebraskans. For a full list of membership benefits, visit our website. A special thanks to the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for their financial support, which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs across the state. We'd also like to thank LNK-TV, a service of the City of Lincoln, who produces these programs. If you would like to watch previous Brown Bag lectures, visit the Nebraska History YouTube page and see the playlists. The title of today's program is How Do Archeologists Know Where to Dig? Rob Bozell, a native of Omaha, is the Nebraska State Archeologist and has been involved in archaeology in Nebraska for 40 years. His professional interests include working with Native American tribes, repatriation, and analysis of animal bone remains from archaeological sites, presenting archaeology to the public, and late, prehistoric, and early contact periods Plains archaeology. Regarding your questions, Rob would prefer you wait till the end, but if you are dying to ask, he will take questions. Please help me welcome Rob Bozell.
Yeah, if you have a question, you can't contain yourself, just raise your hand. And I'll try to probably talk for 45 minutes or so, and I'll give us some time for questions. The reason that we're doing this talk, and I'm going to turn on my timer thing. We've been talking for many years about doing an exhibit about archaeology here at the museum. It's been a long time since we've had anything. And we talked about, well, how should we do it? And some people came up with the notion that, what are the questions that you archaeologists get asked the most? Think about those questions that people always ask you out on a dig or when they email you or call you. And so we kind of built it around that. That is actually, the title is really just, I don't know what all this stuff is. It's really just one of the questions. How do you know where to dig? That's a question we always get. We'll talk about that. But I want to talk about some other questions. And I'm not going to answer all the questions, but and this is going to be, pretty simple-minded. I just kind of want to go through, and again, if you have additional questions, feel free to ask. It's very kind of informal. The exhibit is called Piecing Together the Past, like piecing together, like pieces. And it opens November 22nd. There'll be an opening, there'll be some events here, I don't know what, and then it'll be up for a year or maybe more. We don't quite know yet, but at least a year. So come back and see it over and over and over again. Okay. The one, just to kind of clarify, and people get this confused, and it's natural, isn't archaeology and paleontology and geology all kind of the same stuff? And the answer is no, but we do cross over a fair amount. And and a lot of you may know this, but the paleontology, those folks kind of come out of biology. They study prehistoric plants and animal life, okay? A lot of it's buried, so a lot of the techniques are the same, but they're interested in plants and animals. Archaeology is kind of comes out of history and anthropology. We're concerned with humans. So we look at places and things that people left behind, okay? That's the main difference. A lot of the techniques are the same. And geology, that's really kind of the study of the earth. How's the earth formed, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of similarity, and we have, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples where paleontologists and geologists help us a lot. For some reason, they never ask us to help them, but they help us quite a bit, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. As you might imagine, as archaeologists, we deal with a lot of rocks, particularly with pre-contact Native American people. Their economy was based on Stone Age tools. And so geologists have helped us a lot to identify different kinds of stone, where it comes from, where people might have quarried it. And these are just some pieces of flint. So a lot of that stuff we wouldn't know if it wasn't for geologists. They also, as you might imagine, we spend a lot of time in the dirt. We spend a lot of time digging. We're not really trained to understand what all those different layers of dirt mean. But geologists, particularly a subgroup called geomorphologists, that's what their specialty is. What are all, you guys have probably seen in road cuts and creek banks, these different layers, different soil bands. Those mean things. They can tell you, you can tell how old those bands are. They can tell what landscape they represent. They can tell us about what the climate was like, what animals and plants were around. So all those are really important questions to us as archaeologists to kind of figure out, well, if there are archaeological sites buried in all these different layers, what was it like back then? Was it colder? Was it hotter? Is it, what were the animals like? What were the plant like? All that relates to the kind of questions that we try to answer. A picture of actually an archaeologist. So we spend a lot of time with these geomorphologists out in the field. They help us quite a bit. Working on a project now. It's kind of in its infancy, but we're using these geologists who really understand the world beneath us, and they can, with a lot of information they have about soils and buried layers and zones, Jessica, zones. It's almost like they can, like the surface is a carpet, and they kind of pick it up and look underneath it and kind of tell us about it. And one thing that we're working with some to do is we have always been kind of nervous that we're not finding enough sites that are deeply buried. And so we have money from the Nebraska Department of Transportation to have these geologists help us figure out where on the landscape it's most likely to find these deeply buried sites. These are sites you're not going to find just walking around cornfields and stuff, but they may be 10, 15 feet deep. And this is, I don't even know where this is. It's some creek valley in eastern Nebraska. But the red areas are ones that the geologists tell us are most likely to have buried archaeological sites. And the green areas, probably not. Now, again, that's not very sexy, but if the Department of Transportation is going to build a bridge across one of those creeks, they're going to want to know, if they're going to have problems. And so it behooves them and other agencies that are planning construction projects for us to be better informed about where things may be. So that's another example of how geology really kind of intersects. This is the typical thing we're looking for. Again, if you're standing up on top, walking through that field, you're not going to see that buried 3,000-year-old fireplace, 6 or 8 feet deep. But that model that those geologists are doing are going to try to kind of help us to narrow down where we should look. Paleontology. The main difference between paleontology and archaeology is the paleontologists have much cooler hats. They got those great kind of fieldy hats and the sunglasses. But our archaeologist, Brian Goodrich, who's sitting out there, does have a safety vest on. This is a DOT project. He's got a safety vest on, but Shane and his buddy do not. Tom, make sure that you tell Shane. This is a kind of an interesting project and how these things cross-cut. This is a project, Shane Tucker, the guy in the middle, is the DOT also sponsors a highway paleontology program where they not just look for archaeology, but they do paleontology on their construction projects. University State Museum does that, okay? We do the archaeology, they do the paleontology. Again, they're different professions, but Shane, who's just recently discovered an ancient bison out on the North Loop River Valley, where these guys are, doesn't know how old it is, but it may be 10 or 12,000 years old. It's in that range where people were around. And he thought it was just a dead bison. It was a paleontology site, but then he started finding little chips of flint that were made from making stone tools, okay? And he contacted us, and here's kind of where it is. It's not an environment where you'd really expect archaeology, so we're a little puzzled. Are those pieces of flint in place? Are they washing in somehow? We don't know the answer to that yet, but we're going to figure out. So we work with paleontologists sometime, and this is a great example. And again, when we're out doing our work and we find fossil beds, we'll contact Shane and the people at the University of Nebraska State Museum. If Shane finds prehistoric stone tools or anything that's archaeological, they'll contact us. So even though they're different professions, there are certainly some similarities. That's, if you can kind of see, that's this buffalo that they're exposing. That's the part of the skull laying upside down. You can see, I guess I have a pointer here. There's one of the tooth rows, that's one of the horns, so it's laying down, with its, like it's the top of it's down in the dirt, and they're just being exposed. And they're going to work on that a little more, maybe this season or next season. So we'll give another talk on that a year from now when we get the answers to that, or not. Another great example of paleontology and archaeology kind of working together. Anybody know where this is? I'll bet you do. Where is it? No, you're wrong.
Then I didn't.
You didn't know where it was. Anybody else want to take a guess?
Bison bone bed near Shatner.
Yes, it's called the Hudson Ming site. It's up north of Crawford, way up in Sioux County. It's a site that's been known for 40, 50 years. It's a bison bone bed, okay, and it's pretty much what you see. It's a big layer of bison bone, all kind of disarticulated. And I think it's only a fragment that they've worked on. This thing was originally thought to be an archaeological site where 10,000 years ago, some Native American hunters killed a bunch of buffalo and butchered them and had camps around that. You get that stuff out in western Nebraska and the high plains. But others have come along thinking, well, maybe a natural die. Like maybe these animals died for, smoke inhalation, a forest fire, or a lightning strike, or all kinds of kind of crazy ideas. And some people said maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe they died naturally and people are scavenging them. And anyway, it's a very complex site. And if you're ever up in northwest Nebraska, take an extra couple hours and go see it. It's owned by the U.S. Forest Service. They've got a building built over it, as you can see, and it's exposed. It's kind of a, it's a little off the beaten track. It's probably, half hour north of Crawford maybe on a little, oil road. But it's worth seeing. It's a really neat site, and it's in public ownership, and the U.S. Forest Service has done a really good job of interpreting it. Okay, the question we get all most time is how you know where to dig. How you know where to dig. Some of these kind of fancy looking panels, those are some early things we've been getting from the exhibit designers. So you'll see some of these if you win, not if, but when you come to the exhibit in November. We get this question a lot, and it's a really good question. There's not one answer, there's a lot of answers. And I want to go through some of the answers about how we know where to dig. We're not just born with this knowledge, we certainly don't learn it in school. A lot of times what we do is, like I mentioned, we do a lot of work for the Department of Transportation, okay? And so we go out where they're gonna widen a highway or build a highway, and we will look over that entire landscape. We'll walk across the surface, and walk in cornfields, look in creek banks, look in road cuts for evidence of old, ancient, buried occupations. So a lot of it's just simply footwork, and it's a lot of walking. This is out in the sandhills. And another thing I should mention, most sites, because of the need for water, are going to be within a mile or so of water. Not all by any means, but most of the camps and villages are going to be near water. People need to be near water. Here's an example where, there's a site up there in the grass, can't see anything, nothing. Maybe a flake or two on, gopher burrows, but you go down this road cut and there's stuff all over the place. Animal bone and stone tools and pottery. So we just need to kind of really be aware of the landscape and look where we can look. But as I said, sometimes we don't know what's deep under the ground. That's why we need geologists to kind of help us out. Aerial photography. This is a site, I believe, in Cheyenne or Kimball County. Pretty sure it's Cheyenne County. It's an air photo. Those things are probably 10, 15 feet in diameter. Anybody who's not an archaeologist want to tell me what those are? Teepee rings, right. And they're rings of rock that probably anchored teepees, okay? You get those a lot in areas where you don't have a lot of tree cover, you can't make, wooden tent pegs, or if it's before native folks had iron, so they're going to use rocks. And there's not very many in Nebraska. They're really pretty rare. But boy, you get up in Wyoming and Montana and Alberta, and they're amazing. If you're out there just walking across that, particularly if it's heavy pasture, you may not see those. I mean, you may not realize, you just see a bunch of rocks. So aerial photography can really enhance those. There's some fancy techniques that I don't really know. So I'm going to skip over the fancy schmancy stuff. There's a thing called LiDAR. And I think I can tell you what LiDAR stands for, but I'm not quite sure and doesn't really matter. But what LiDAR does, it measures really, really fine-grained changes in elevation. The thing that's, I find amazing about it, and I don't know how it does it, but there's people that know, it can see through tree canopy. I mean, it can, this is in Fontenelle Forest. Anybody know where Fontenelle Forest is? Okay. Heavily, heavily tree covered, south of Omaha. And it's going to be hard for you guys to see, but these circles we've drawn, there are little rectangles and circles within these red circles. Those are all 800 or 1,000-year-old where lodges were, where Native American houses were. Those houses are gone, but these are not teepees. These are substantial structures made of wood and earth, and they're dug in basins like pit houses. And it all collapsed in, they're abandoned centuries and centuries ago, and they leave these little dish-shaped things. Well, LiDAR can see those, and it's a great tool. Yeah.
Would that be considered a wiki-up then? Is that what they call it?
No, we kind of consider them precursors of the Earth Lodge. They're a little more than wiki-up. Wiki-ups are more kind of just wooden teepees. These actually, I think later on I have a picture of an excavated one that you'll see. More fancy schmancy stuff, and this is great. We do work with the National Park Service and some other consultants that have a lot of equipment that's geophysical equipment. And there's a lot of different kinds, and again, I don't want to go into it, partly because I don't really know a lot about this stuff, that can look under the ground. Again, it's like pulling up a carpet and looking under the ground. And what does it look for? It looks for things like changes in the compaction of soil. It can look for changes in magnetism. It can look for burning, metal, all kinds of stuff that there's no way to see that on the ground, okay? And this is actually radar, I think, right? And that's the radar. This is a site out in the sandhills. That pasture behind these guys is littered with, some artifacts. But again, we don't know what's really under the ground. So we had these folks come out, and they did this survey with magnetometers, and they come up with what they call anomalies. I'm going to step back a little bit so I can see what the heck I'm talking about. Again, these red circles, just to give you a sense of scale, those little tiny checkerboard squares are about a yard in diameter. So it's a pretty big area. And when they did this survey, they came up with these kind of what they call anomalies. There's something there. It's burned, or it's more compact, or both. And you guys should dig there. And that's what we did. And they are, sure enough, marking lodges. Again, this may be more of kind of a wiki-up sort of thing. Some kind of lodge. This is an Apache site that dates in the 1600s. There's no way from walking across the surface you would know that those are in those specific locations, okay? And this is all fairly new technology, the last 30 or 40 years. Anyway, so yeah, it's really great stuff. Again, those kind of things are not going to find an archaeological site, but boy, they can tell you a lot. They can really parse out what's there, what's important, and where the concentrations of things like houses are, or deposits of bone, or trash pits, or fireplaces, and all that stuff. And also, not to kind of belabor the point, but some of these other little stains, we did some more work out there last summer. They turned out to be fireplaces. So I mean, it's great. It's a great tool. Archival stuff, particularly working on early Euro-American sites, towns and forts and farmsteads and fur trade posts, that kind of stuff, okay? That's when you start getting a lot more what we call archival information. Photographs, maps, journals, drawings, because before 300 or 400 years ago, the only thing that really kind of tell us is archaeology and oral tradition, which I'm going to talk about oral tradition here in a minute. Once you start getting maps, that can really also enhance things. This is a map of, I think it's about an 1860s map of a little town, I believe in Seward or Saline County, called Camden. Camden hasn't been there in 100 years. I mean, it was gone by the early 1900s. Anybody ever heard of Camden? Seward County, Saline County. There are a lot of these little towns. They just, they were there, they didn't really make it. But if you look closely, this is the Blue River, I believe. Somebody made this map and they show the streets and the buildings and everything. Now you walk out there now, all you get is a big scatter of bricks and glass and stuff. Well, you look at this map and you can really narrow down where's the buildings. These are pretty accurate maps. Same thing with old photographs. We worked on a mill by Nebraska City a few years ago. We have this limestone wall coming out of this bank. Guy said it's this old mill from the 1850s, and they actually found some photographs. Now, we haven't quite figured out how these stone walls correlate with what we found, but they do. And again, so that photograph kind of has been and will be real helpful in interpreting, what some of these foundations we see. Okay. Oral traditions. For a long time, archaeology and Native Americans didn't have a lot of interaction. And Native folks have got these long, rich oral traditions that archaeologists are now taking a little more seriously and figure out, particularly with, trying to figure out old village locations and migration routes and, things like that. Because most Native people, they didn't really have a written record. It's all oral. So that oral tradition, these, passing these stories down, had a much greater significance and depth. And so figuring out, when are they talking about when they lived there and came here, and what village might this be? It's really pretty interesting. And so we've actually got a couple consultants, a guy named Lance Foster and a guy named Roger Echohawk, who are kind of historians with a couple of tribes that are going to contribute things to this exhibit about using oral tradition and how it works and how it kind of doesn't work and why it doesn't always match up. Anyway, I'm going to... And this is Roger. Roger is a Pawnee historian, an anthropologist, and he's got some traditions about, when the Pawnee kind of became the Pawnee out of the murky prehistoric past and when they started living in these big villages. In fact, he wrote a little thing, which I'm just going to read because I think it kind of captures it. You guys can probably see it, but I'll read it anyway. Long ago as night fell, and this is going to be in the exhibit. Long ago as night fell over the earth-lodged cities and hunting camps of Pawnee land, people would gather to tell stories. There would follow long hours of singing and laughter and narrative journeying. As distant stars wafted above, the Pawnees told many kinds of stories, including traditions handed down from ancient times. What kind of light does oral tradition shed on ancient history? From the beginning days of archaeology in Nebraska, as excavations and surveys proceeded in the Pawnee homeland, scholars occasionally pondered this question. But in recent decades, the study of oral tradition and archaeology has begun to open fascinating new vistas on the history of ancient Pawnee land. I should have had him write the whole exhibit script. That's pretty good. But I think it does kind of capture how, there's important stuff in there. And what he's going to do, and it's going to be probably one panel or two panels, he's got these old village names and it's kind of correlating them with what we think are known archaeological sites. Some of them we don't know. In fact, he said some of these, I don't have a good archaeological site for it. Plus, we have archaeological sites that don't match any of his oral traditions. I think that makes it exciting. Let's figure out, let's keep digging deeper, in the traditions and the archaeology and see what this stuff's really about. Lance Foster, who's a member of the Iowa tribe. You guys know Lance?
No,
Okay.
I've hunted that site there at Genova before.
Oh,
Kind of in that area, so.
Yeah.
On some private ground.
yeah,
There's
okay,
a lot of artifacts there.
yep. Lance is kind of doing the same thing, he's taken a very specific map. Wait. This was a map, I guess, drawn by or supervised by a guy named Noheart. Randy, do you know who Noheart was? He was an Iowa chief. He died in the 1830s. And he made this map based on a lot of oral traditions of not just Iowa, but also, I think, Ponca, Omaha, Odo, Missouri, all these kind of Eastern Siouan speakers who were moving out here, over the last 1,000 years into Iowa and Nebraska. And, you look at it and think, well, that doesn't look like anything around here. Well, Lance and some other people using GIS have kind of tried to geo-reference some of this stuff just to get you a little oriented. These are probably river valleys. In fact, that's probably the Missouri River. That's probably the Mississippi. That's probably the Platte. And these little circles with little dots in them are villages, okay? And these little lines of dots are trails. And these circles are lakes, okay? So some people that are really good with GIS and georeferencing and old maps have tried to figure all this stuff out. And it's not a one-to-one, but they've done a pretty good job of kind of correlating the Noheart Map of 1837 with some known archaeological sites. For example, okay, you're starting to recognize this. That's the Platte River. There's Plattsmouth. Lincoln's here. Omaha's here. Noheart depicts 3 villages along the Nebraska side of the Missouri and one over here on the west side of the Platte River. I know exactly what that one is. That's the Utan site. It's a big Odo village. The Iowas probably live there. Missourians probably live there. And that's what he's talking about. There's a big Iowa Odo village in downtown Omaha, which is now gone because of downtown Omaha. Not the DOT. Okay, just so you know, it's not the DOT. That it's probably one of those. Anyway, and then they figured out some of these villages in Iowa. So this is really important stuff, to see, to take these oral traditions and say, well, I think we can match up this stuff with these known archaeological places. And if their stories tell you some things about these places, that's more than we know as archaeologists about how to interpret, what we find. So, yeah, another map, the same thing. And okay, another question we get all the time. How much is this stuff worth and can you keep it? Do you guys get to keep everything you find? It's worth a lot, and yes, we do get to keep it. But not, I'm just kidding, that was a joke. We don't get to keep it at home. In fact, I don't collect anything. I mean, I collect records and crap. I don't have any. I think I have a pot I bought in New Mexico, and I don't. But we do actually keep it. And a lot of people will say, oh yeah, look at that. That's those two there. Yeah, it's a good picture. A lot of people will say to us, well, if you dig up all this stuff, and it ends up just in a museum or in the basement of the State Historical Site, what good is it for? Why do you do it? And I wanted to kind of address that. We have a really nice curation facility out on the northeast side of town. It's climate controlled, humidity controlled, really good place. And we have hundreds of thousands of objects. Now, some of it may be little pieces of flint, pieces of animal bone, broken pottery, broken rocks, all of which sounds, that's not that interesting. But we're always having other archaeologists and other, graduate students look at our collections and borrow our collections. That's what they're for. I mean, they're really for two things. One is, for museum interpretation, like the objects that are going to go in this exhibit, 20 minutes or 20 seconds? The objects that are going to go in this exhibit are probably the best of what we got. The nicest ceramic vessels, the nicest stone tools, you know. And it's going to be 0.0001% of our entire collections, okay? But we look at those collections as not have any monetary value, but they have knowledge value and research value. And we like for people to use them. And I can just think in my little short career, so many things that nobody thought of 30 or 40 years ago to do with these old things. DNA, we'll talk a little bit about DNA here in a minute. Looking for finding, blood residue on 1,000-year-old chipstone tools and saying, oh yeah, this is from killing a buffalo, or this is from, fishing. I mean, you can do that now. You can now look at DNA, not just human DNA, but DNA of dogs and horses. We're doing that now. And they're being able to tell how are these Native American dogs related to different dogs in different tribes. Horse DNA can tell us about kind of the evolution of, horses that spread from the Southwest onto the plains and how they changed, and all this kind of stuff that you just never really think about. There's a woman, Linda Plock, who just retired from the National Park Service, who's now looking at daub. And we know what daub is. Who would? It's really boring stuff. It's basically in these earth lodges that I'm talking about. It's the clay that was for the roof and the walls, okay? And she's like, it's got all these impressions of what used to be grass and twigs and leaves and logs. Well, she's been working to figure out, I think I can tell what species these are, I mean, who would have thought? And tell us a lot about the construction of these houses and what resources being used to build them. So there's always new stuff. That's why that's the value we look at in these collections. That's why we collect way more than you'll ever see in a museum, okay? We always get the question, people seem to understand, settlers came, before that there was the Sioux and the Omaha and the Ponca and the Pawnee. But what about before? People don't quite understand that the people that were here in the 1800s, the Native Americans, those are the people that have been here for at least 13,000 years and probably 20,000 years. This is a case that some of you might have heard of. The oldest skeleton that I'm aware of in North America was the skeleton of a young boy found in the late 60s in Montana by a family called Anzick. It's called the Anzick site or Anzick boy or something like that. And some of these people who've gotten into DNA talk to the tribe. It's probably Crow, I imagine, who lives up there now. Maybe a couple other tribes. It might have been several tribes. And the owners of the landowners about trying to extract DNA out of this little tiny skeleton. And lots of negotiations, and they ended up saying, okay, let's do it. But we're going to rebury this young kid afterwards. And they did it. And one thing it proved is that's who these people are from 15,000 years ago. Their closest ancestors are modern Native Americans. So people sometimes say, well, is it kind of Neanderthals or cavemen or Stone Age people from Europe? No, it's the people that are Native Americans today. This is their ancestors, and they probably came across the Bering Strait in several waves and down the Pacific coast, or it gets complicated, but they kind of came from up in here. Now, here's a good example of oral tradition. I know Native folks who say, you're wrong. We've always been here for forever. We didn't come here 13,000 years ago. We've always been here. We don't look at it that way. Well, that's a problem. We need to sort of continue to work through that stuff. That's why it's kind of exciting. Just a quick kind of preview. I got 15 minutes left.
Those are some beautiful examples. Are those
You can't have them.
Well, can I look at them?
Yeah, come to the museum because they're all going to be on display. I think every one of those. This is just kind of an idea, and again, these are sites in Nebraska, points from Nebraska. This is sites that are, between 9,000 and 12,000 years old. At that time, people were pretty nomadic. You don't get these villages. You don't even get really base camps. There are kill sites and really transitory camps all over the plains, but in a very kind of mobile pattern. They're probably not large groups of people. We don't know much about them. Again, those sites are deeply buried. We don't know much about them, but they're here. And that's just an artist's reconstruction. This is long before the bow and arrow, long before, agriculture, long before, building earth lodges and all that. And as time progressed, people, kind of became more settled for whatever reason. A couple thousand years ago, they started growing corn. They started living in villages, kind of more sedentary, not just camps. This is an example of one of these excavated lodges I was telling you guys about. This is about a maybe 900-year-old house up in Sarpy County. These posts on these holes on the outside are where the posts were. Posts aren't there, but the wood rots in the ground. It leaves a dark stain. Okay, they're post holes. That tells you these are big houses, and they're timber framed, covered with earth or this daub stuff. These big holes in the middle are storage pits where these people, by this time, 1,000 years ago, they're growing tons of corn. Lots of corn in there and squash and beans, and they would also sometimes fill those pits up with trash. So they're really, really rich archaeological sites. And they're also making a lot of pottery at that time too, okay? And their villages look like something like this. This is the last Odo, Missouri village in Nebraska before they moved to Oklahoma on a reservation. It's down by a little town called Barnston. You know where Barnston is? You guys from Barnston? I know you're not. Anyway, this is kind of and it was painted by the Indian agent in the 60s. It's kind of neat to look at because it's really one of the last, vestiges of what these Native American villages would have been around for a long time looked like. And this one's kind of neat because it's got earth lodges, but it's also got really old traditional like wigwam kind of things. You see those, Randy? Aren't those look like? See those? And that's a real holdover from when these people lived back east in the Midwest and the Great Lakes 1,000 years ago. So and it's kind of neat because we didn't know that really until you look at this painting that they were still building wigwams out here. And there's teepees down here. And anyway, and so that's really shortly before most tribes were either removed or they ended up on reservations here in Nebraska. Big question we get all the time. This will be the last question. Say that 10 minutes? No, the timing's pretty good. Okay. You ever find dead people and what happens to them? Yeah, we find a lot. And this is actually just as a kind of photograph. This is Rebecca Winters. Anybody who knows who Rebecca Winters is? She was a Mormon, right? Mormon trail pioneer, died on the trail and was buried out there by Gering, Scotts Bluff. We had to actually move her because she was too close to the railroad tracks. Now they're talking about moving her again. We're not involved, but anyway. So yeah, we do. And the question that people ask is, what about repatriation? Why don't you give these back, to the tribes? Because most of them, honestly, are Native American. Not all, but most of them are. When some laws were passed, and one of the earliest laws was passed in Nebraska, kind of the model for the federal law about returning human remains to tribes was passed in Nebraska. And then there's a federal law which is kind of modeled after, it's different, deals with different kind of stuff. But so we've been working since the late 80s, 30 years. And when we first started, we had probably around 1,500 skeletons, portions of skeletons in our collections, okay? And as you might imagine, the reason this all kind of started is when Native people got wind of that, they found that offensive and unacceptable. And that's how there was lots of negotiations and lots of fighting, and things are a lot better now, but it's still a process. And I just kind of was looking yesterday when I was preparing this. We've repatriated lots of remains to the Pawnee. The State Historical Society, or History Nebraska, whatever it's called now, is a lot of the work we did was at Pawnee sites. Okay, the university did a lot of work at Omaha sites. We ended up with a lot of Pawnee individuals. We repatriated almost all of the remains that were Pawnee to the Pawnee. They've been long reburied, repatriated. A few years ago, we realized, and because of some kind of glitches in the law, it didn't really deal with what we call unaffiliated. Okay, with remains that we know they're Native American, we can't tell what tribe. Too old, no associated artifacts. We don't know. We don't know, and we're not going to know. And that was kind of a glitch in both the state and the federal laws. It kind of assumes that, yeah, Indians and archaeologists will figure it out and give it to the right people. So there's been some change in the law and some reinterpretations to deal with what we call unaffiliated. We were still left with 600 unaffiliated 2 years ago. And we've had a series of meetings, Randy's been at them, with tribes to kind of sit down and scratch our heads and say, what do we do? What do we do with these? And the decision that was reached is that we would do an agreement with all the tribes of everybody who possibly lived in Nebraska. We've got that hammered out. We've got, we recently reburied about 130 with one tribe. We've got about 500 left. And I think they're just going to go in the ground next summer, maybe this fall. But, and then we'll kind of be done with all these, you know, human remains in our collections. You know, I think people found it offensive that they were considered scientific specimens. Now again, the DNA, you know, I mean, there's, you know, there's a lot of important research that has come out of this. But I think if you weigh everything, it's probably more important to, you know, get them back in the ground. Anyway, so yes, but we also do our office, and that's one of these meetings. You might have left, Randy, before. See, that's what you get for leaving early. You don't get in the pictures. We all look happy there, but it's kind of a tough couple days, actually. But, it's good. This is a couple of the repatriations. We had 4 or 5 individuals that were Cheyenne. They were probably victims at the Cheyenne breakout, okay? And we repatriated them to Cheyenne. They came down from Lame Deer, Montana, and took them and drove them back up. They did a little blessing in our parking lot. They said it's fine if I use this picture. Here's a couple of Omaha fellows talking to us about a 1860s, 1880s cemetery up by Macy that we didn't know about, that we had to move some graves for a DOT project. We do some forensic work. When we get a lot of calls from cops. 5 minutes, this is perfect, okay? Does that include the question time? Okay, because I'm about done here. Our office is kind of charged with, if people find bones, particularly human bones, they first you call law enforcement, okay? Make sure it's not a homicide or a missing person. If it looks archaeological, they call us, okay? And then we will try to preserve them in place. We'll contact the tribes. We haven't had any this year, but we'll contact, various tribes, the Nebraska Indian Commission, and we want to try to leave them in place. A lot of times by the time we get called, they're already disinterred. So we can then collect them and then, again, work with tribes to get them back in the ground. But like this young woman, her name's Kari. This is an old picture. She was a UNL graduate student, Kari Sandness. Remember Kari? Okay. She now works at the Smithsonian. So a lot of these, remains, they do a lot of forensic work. You see, this is, I don't know what's in this photograph other than it's clear somebody who died with a gunshot to the head. We involved in a little bit of that. I've helped excavate 3 or 4 homicide victims, that had been murdered and then buried, shallow graves and under houses and stuff, where they were really kind of skeletons. So we get involved with helping law enforcement to recover those. And then forensic anthropologists and doctors who really deal with cause of death and that kind. We don't get into that stuff, but we did certainly help with kind of some of the technology. I think this is my last slide. A couple of just sort of things related to that. There's a woman who I think she's still alive, and she's got to be around 90, named Betty Pat Gatliff. Betty Pat Gatliff is this woman on the rear side, that is, and she was kind of not the pioneer, but pioneer in doing facial reconstructions. Knowing the thickness of tissue on the cheeks and the forehead, and taking skulls. And a lot, again, with missing persons, trying to put a face to these. And we heard about Betty Pat. We have one soldier from Fort Atkinson, a guy named Lieutenant Gabriel Field. And we know it's Gabriel Field because when he was plowed up north of Fort Atkinson in the 50s, the headstone was there. It said Lieutenant Gabriel Field. He also had an amputated leg, and we knew that the guy had an amputated leg, and that's actually what he died was from infection or gangrene. So we wanted to put a face on Gabriel Field, and we had Betty Pat Gatliff do it. And that was, again, in the late 80s or 90s. And again, she's done a lot of that stuff. So you know, there's kind of a cross cut between archaeology and forensic work. We don't have any forensic anthropologists on staff, but you know, anyway, so that's it. I had some pictures of some of the old-time archaeologists, but we're about done, which is good. The pictures were in case I got done quick, so, which I didn't. So now is the time for questions. Sharon? Okay, and it said on my little cheat sheet, if nobody has any questions, I can continue to blather on, which, so you might want to ask questions. Yes, sir.
Have you ever done any digging up around Stanton, Nebraska? I mean, I've read some stuff about the bloodiest battle between red bloods happened in Stanton, Nebraska, between the Sioux Indians that came down. I mean, is there any truth to any of this? I mean, I've found
We had that as a project, right, Karen? I mean, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm being told to repeat the question. I always forget this. His question was, do we know anything about Stanton, a site near Stanton where there was allegedly a really massive battle between the Sioux and...
it was the Ponca and Omaha. Had
Right.
some-
Big battle. I think it's a heavily embellished story. Randy, you know anything about this?
That site is significant to the Poncas. They had a village there,
Yeah.
and they would go back and forth between the Omahas. The Omaha and Ponca were one tribe at one time, so that's where they would meet. Fish to live there.
Repeat what Randy said? This is getting complicated. Randy Tebow has worked both for the Ponca tribe and the Winnebago tribe as their historic preservation officer. He's here to keep me honest. Okay. What Randy said was that, yes, there is a big village there that's Omaha Ponca, and we know about it. In fact, I think it's a couple villages. One in the 1800s, late 1700s, probably also there's a big Oneota village there too, an earlier one. Okay, so there is a bunch of archaeology around Stanton, and it's Omaha Ponca related. We can't find any really corroborating evidence of this massive battle. I think it's kind of lore, and here's what I think happens. Because the Omahas and Poncas lived there a long time, and there have been a lot of skeletons, and some of which are the ones that us, the university, have already repatriated that have been plowed up or found as Stanton got developed. In fact, the Stanton Cemetery was probably also the Omaha Ponca Cemetery. There's graves up in there.
That's what I've read.
Okay, so you get these graves. Yes, there's conflicts between the Ponca and the Omaha and the Sioux. That's a real thing. But I think it became local lore that, yeah, you got a bunch of skeletons and it must be from some battle. We can't find any evidence, right, Karen, that it's really true. I think, yes, there are skeletons and there is archaeology. That happens a lot. I think people, like a lot of times we'll find arrowheads. Well, there are a bunch of arrowheads here. It must have been a battle. Well, no, it's probably just where people lived and were making and lost arrowheads. So I don't have any evidence that there was this. There might have been a skirmish. I mean, they were not friendly. The Sioux and the Omaha and Ponca were not friends. Whether there was this giant battle, because I've heard, with thousands of people killed. I don't believe it. John?
In the Barnston picture,
Yes.
there's a school or a church or.
Yes.
something. Is that one of the buildings is still standing?
I don't know. John's question was in Barnston, there's a picture of a church or a school, one of those frame buildings kind of in the middle. I don't know. I don't think so. Karen, do you know? You're kind of familiar with that part of the world.
There's a part of a building, but I think it's been moved.
Karen says there is part of a building. It probably dates that period, but it's been moved. So I don't. My guess is that those are not extant buildings. Yes, sir.
The recent flooding that we've had,
Yes.
does that uncover newer stuff for you to look at, or is that?
Yes. Yes and no. Again, there's been a tremendous amount of flooding, as we all know. I'm sorry. Don't ever have me do this again. See, this is why I can't get this straight. His question was, has the recent flooding exposed a lot of archaeology, right? Okay. Massive floods, I'm sure the answer is yes. It's exposed all kinds of stuff. The only little glimpses that we have gotten as archaeologists are looking at specific projects for the DOT and also some federal agriculture offices who are assisting farmers in restoring their fields. And we have to go out and look at those fields and seeing if the restoration is going to affect archaeology. So we've looked at, 0.0001% of area that's been flooded, right? I mean, and we have found some sites. Unfortunately, the sites we find are pretty damaged by the flooding, like those fields. It's amazing. I had never seen that, but I looked at about 10 or 15 of these projects for the Department of Agriculture. And it's almost like a giant grizzly bear just came and clawed these fields, or just these, big furrows down to the sand. And yeah, there's artifacts, but the site has been really pretty beat up. Got room for one more question, or none. We got 2 minutes.
What is the oldest artifact that you found, or most interesting?
Randy's question is, what's the oldest artifact that we have found, that I have found? That we have found in Nebraska, that's a good question. We have Clovis points, which are 13,000 years old, that have been found in Nebraska. We don't have any Clovis sites, intact sites. But I think the Clovis points that have been found are the oldest objects. The oldest ones I've personally found, I found a Folsom point one time, which is a little bit younger, 11,000 years old. Yeah, I didn't take it home. It's in the basement somewhere. 1 minute.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
I was just curious as to the Scotts Bluff, the Angus Story, the points you put up earlier. Are they going to be in your display?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah, they are.
Will be a visit.
I think those very ones, yeah. In that period that we call Paleo-Indian, we don't have much to say about it other than points. I mean, we don't know much about it. We haven't, Hudson Ming, that's a Paleo-Indian site. There's a few more in the Medicine Creek area in Frontier County, but we don't have a lot in Nebraska that have been excavated. I think there are a lot of them, but they're deeply buried. Sharon's nodding like to shut up, so I'll shut up.